Sometimes rock bottom is exactly where your life is supposed to begin. Gerrit Albee learned that truth. At 47, homeless, and down to his last $50, he bought an abandoned car for that money, a rusted sedan someone left on a wooded trail. He just needed shelter, a place to sleep that wasn't a borrowed tent. The keys were still in the ignition when he found it. That first night, looking for something to keep warm, he opened the trunk and found a metal lockbox under the spare tire. Inside were old maps, film reels, and government papers stamped 1972. Someone had hidden them there on purpose. What secret was buried in that box? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Gerrit Albee hadn't always been the kind of man who slept in a tent in the Oregon woods. There was a time when he'd worn pressed shirts to an office job, when he'd kissed his daughter goodbye at the front door of a house he owned, when the biggest worry in his life was whether to refinance the mortgage or wait another year. That version of himself felt like someone else's memory now, like a photograph of a stranger who just happened to look like him. The collapse hadn't been dramatic. No single catastrophic event had stripped away his life. Instead, it had been a slow erosion, one piece crumbling after another until there was nothing left to stand on. First came the divorce. Angela had been patient for years with his long hours at the logistics company, but patience has limits. Then the company downsized, and at 45, Gerrit discovered that middle management experience meant less than he'd thought in a job market that wanted younger, cheaper workers. Savings drained. Apartment lost. Pride swallowed in increments so small he barely noticed until it was completely gone. For the past 8 months, he'd been living in a borrowed tent on a patch of public land outside Timber Creek, a small Oregon town where the lumber industry's glory days were long behind it. The tent belonged to Pastor Mike at First Methodist, who ran a soup kitchen and never asked questions that made people feel smaller than they already did. Gerrit ate there twice a week, showered at the community center, and worked odd jobs when he could find them. Frank Donnelly at Donnelly Hardware gave him day labor whenever possible, unloading trucks, organizing inventory, sweeping up. Frank was in his 60s, with hands that had built half the decks in Timber Creek and a quiet kindness that never felt like pity. He paid cash, never shorted anyone, and always sent Gerrit home with something: batteries, a warm jacket, once a sleeping bag that Frank claimed had been taking up space in the back. The hardest part wasn't the cold nights or the uncertain meals, it was Emma. His daughter was 12 now, living with Angela in Eugene. The custody arrangement gave him alternate weekends, but that required transportation and a stable place to take her. He hadn't seen Emma in person for 3 months. Their relationship had been reduced to brief phone calls when he could borrow minutes on a prepaid phone, conversations where he heard his daughter's voice growing more distant, more hesitant, as if she was learning to protect herself from disappointment. He kept one photograph in his wallet, a crayon drawing Emma had made when she was 6. A yellow sun, a house with a red door, 2 stick figures holding hands labeled "Dad" and "Me." The paper was soft from handling, the colors faded, but he looked at it every day. It reminded him that he'd been someone's hero once, and maybe could be again. The decision to buy the car had come from pure desperation, mixed with a thread of hope so thin it was almost invisible. Dale Pritchard ran a salvage yard on Route 20, and Gerrit had heard through Frank that Dale had an old sedan he wanted gone. "Thing's been sitting at the edge of my lot for 2 years, Dale had said, scratching his greying beard. "Got it at auction. Nobody wanted it. Been meaning to scrap it, but haven't gotten around to it. You got $50? It's yours. Hell, keys are still in it. $50. Gerrit had earned it over 3 days of work, helping Frank inventory an entire shipment of plumbing supplies. It was supposed to last him 2 weeks, but the rains were coming heavier, and the tent leaked, and the thought of having actual walls and a roof, even if the car didn't run, felt like luxury. The sedan was a faded blue Mercury Marquis, probably from the late 70s, judging by its boat-like dimensions. Rust consumed the wheel wells and bubbled along the doors. The interior smelled of mildew and old vinyl, but the seats were intact and the windows closed. Dale showed him where it sat at the far edge of the property, half hidden by blackberry bushes. "Keys work," Dale said, demonstrating by turning the ignition. The engine didn't turn over, no surprise there, but the key fit. Electrical's probably shot, and God knows what else. "But you want somewhere to sleep, she'll do that much." Jarrett handed over his last $50 and took possession of his new home. That first evening, as grey dusk settled over Timber Creek, he arranged his few belongings in the Mercury. A duffel bag with 3 changes of clothes, his sleeping bag, a flashlight, a paperback novel someone had left at the soup kitchen, Emma's drawing which he propped on the dashboard. It wasn't much, but it was his. The rain started around 9, a steady Oregon downpour that would have soaked through the tent in minutes. Inside the car, Jarrett listened to it drum on the metal roof and felt something close to contentment. The windows fogged. The air was close but dry. He'd made the right choice. Around midnight, cold began seeping through the sleeping bag. He remembered Dale mentioning there might be an old blanket in the trunk. Using his flashlight, Jarrett climbed out into the rain, worked the rusty trunk latch, and finally got it open. No blanket, just the spare tire, a jack, and some empty motor oil containers. But as he moved the flashlight around, something caught his attention. The trunk's lining was partially torn away near the wheel well, and beneath it, wedged tight against the tire, was a rectangular shape wrapped in a deteriorating canvas tarp. Jarrett pulled it free. Heavy, solid. He unwrapped the canvas and found himself holding a metal lockbox, about the size of a briefcase, with a simple clasp lock that wasn't engaged. The metal was old, scratched, but not rusted. Someone had taken care to protect this. He carried it back to the front seat, water streaming off his hair, and sat with the heater vent blowing cold air while he opened it. Inside, organized in careful layers, were items that made no immediate sense. 3 metal film canisters, the kind used for movies or photography, each labeled with dates, from 1972. A rolled bundle of topographical maps showing desert terrain, marked with notes and coordinates, and a manila folder thick with papers stamped across the front in faded red ink. Project Helios. Confidential. Property of U. Department of Energy. Jarrett's hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder. The documents were technical, full of terminology he didn't understand. Photovoltaic efficiency ratios, semiconductor arrays, energy conversion specifications. But other pages were more accessible. Memos on official letterhead, budget reports, personnel lists. One name appeared repeatedly: Dr. Sarah Vance, principal investigator. The most recent document was dated November 1973. A terse memo announcing Project Helios's immediate suspension due to budgetary reallocation and shifting national priorities. Someone had hidden this box in this car. Someone had wanted these materials preserved, kept safe, tucked away where they might wait decades to be found. And now, by pure accident, or maybe something else, Jarrett Albee had found them. He sat in the dark car, rain streaming down the windows, holding papers that felt important in a way he couldn't yet articulate. For 8 months, his life had shrunk to the immediate concerns of survival: where to sleep, what to eat, how to stay warm. But now, looking at these mysterious artifacts from a project lost to history, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Curiosity, purpose, the sense that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something that mattered. Jarrett spent a restless night in the Mercury, the lockbox on the passenger seat beside him like a companion. Every time he woke, and he woke often, his hand reached out to confirm it was still there, still real. By dawn, he'd made a decision. Whatever these materials were, they deserved more than his flashlight examination in a salvage yard. They needed proper attention. The Timber Creek Public Library opened at 9. Jarrett used the community center bathroom to clean up as best he could, changed into his least worn shirt, and walked the 2 miles into town with the lockbox tucked under his arm. The morning was clear after the rain, the air sharp and clean, and for the first time in months, he felt like he was walking towards something instead of just away from everything he'd lost. Margaret Chen was shelving books in the reference section when Jarrett entered. She was a fixture at the library, a retired librarian who volunteered 4 days a week because, as she'd once told Frank, books were my career for 40 years. I'm not about to abandon them just because the county started sending me pension checks. She was in her early 70s, with silver hair cut practical and short, and eyes that missed nothing. "Morning, Jarrett," she said, her tone warm but not effusive. Margaret had seen him at the soup kitchen, had helped him find job listings in the newspaper, and had never once treated him like he was. Invisible. "What brings you in today?" He set the lockbox on a reading table. "I need help understanding something I found. It's old, from the 70s, and I think it might be important, but I don't know what half of it means." Margaret's curiosity was immediate and genuine. She sat down across from him, pulling reading glasses from her cardigan pocket. "Show me." Jarrett opened the box and laid out the contents carefully. Margaret examined each item with the methodical attention of someone who'd spent a lifetime organizing information. She studied the maps, ran her fingers over the film canisters, and read through the documents with growing intensity. "Project Helios," she murmured. "I've never heard of it, but that doesn't mean much. The 70s were full of government programs that came and went." She looked up at Jarrett. "Where did you find this?" "In a car I just bought. It was hidden in the trunk." Margaret's expression shifted, something sharpening behind her eyes. "Hidden? Purposefully, you think?" "Had to be. It was wrapped, protected, wedged under the spare tire where you wouldn't see it unless you were looking." She nodded slowly. "Then someone wanted this preserved but not found easily. That's interesting." She tapped the film canisters. "These I can help with. We have a microfiche reader in the back that can handle old film formats. Takes some patience, but we can see what's on them." It took Margaret 20 minutes to set up the equipment in a small room the library used for archival research. The machine was older than Jarrett, a bulky device that hummed and clicked as Margaret threaded the first film reel into place. She adjusted the focus, and images appeared on the viewing screen. What they saw made both of them lean closer. The film showed a desert facility, low buildings surrounded by empty scrubland, mountains visible in the distance. In the foreground, arrays of what looked like solar panels stretched in precise rows, but their design was unusual. These weren't the familiar blue rectangles Jarrett had seen on rooftops. These were different, more complex, with surfaces that seemed to capture light at multiple angles. The next frames showed people in lab coats working around the equipment, taking measurements, consulting clipboards. One frame focused on a woman in her 40s, dark hair pulled back, pointing at something on a panel, while 2 men listened intently. The back of the photo had a handwritten caption visible in one frame. "Dr. Vance explains efficiency breakthrough. May 1972. More images followed. Interior shots of laboratories with equipment that looked both advanced and dated in that peculiar way of old technology. Graphs and charts mounted on walls. Scientists gathered around monitors displaying data. And then, toward the end of the reel, something jarring: men in suits watching as equipment was loaded onto trucks, solar panels being dismantled, buildings being emptied. The final frames showed the facility abandoned, empty, the desert already beginning to reclaim it. Margaret changed to the second reel. This one contained more technical footage, close-ups of the solar panel construction, detailed shots of circuitry, time-lapse sequences showing the panels tracking the sun. The third reel was similar, focused on testing and data collection. When they finished, Margaret sat back and removed her glasses, cleaning them with her cardigan. "Jarrett, I think you found documentation of a research program that was shut down, and from the look of those final images, shut down abruptly." "Why would someone shut down a solar energy project?" Jarrett asked. "Especially in the 70s, with the oil crisis and everything?" "That," Margaret said, "is exactly the right question." She stood and moved to one of the library's computer terminals. "Let me see what I can find about Project Helios and this Dr. Vance." For the next hour, Margaret searched while Jarrett examined the documents more carefully. The technical specifications meant little to him, but the memos and correspondence told a story. Early reports were enthusiastic, full of phrases like unprecedented efficiency and revolutionary potential. Budget reports showed substantial funding through 1972 and into early 1973. Then the tone changed. Memos from Washington questioned costs, suggested the technology was premature, mentioned concerns about market disruption and industry stability. The final document, dated the 12th of November 1973, was a single page. Immediate suspension of all Project Helios activities, materials to be archived, personnel reassigned. Margaret returned with printouts from her search. "I found some things. Project Helios isn't mentioned much in accessible records. Most references are in footnotes of energy policy documents. But Dr. Sarah Vance is easier to track. She was a physicist, specialized in photovoltaic technology, worked at several national laboratories in the 60s and early 70s. She led Project Helios from 1970 to 1973. Margaret paused, her expression troubled. "She died in 1975. Heart attack according to the obituary. She was 48 years old." Something cold settled in Jarrett's chest. "That seems young." "It does," Margaret agreed. "And here's something else interesting. I found a reference to her brother, Robert Vance. He was an engineer, worked in the private sector. After his sister's death, he apparently became something of an activist, writing letters to congressmen about government research policy, trying to get information about Project Helios declassified. Then, in 1976, he disappeared. No death certificate, no forwarding address, just gone." Jarrett looked at the lockbox, understanding beginning to dawn. "You think Robert Vance hid this?" "I think it's possible. If he believed his sister's work was important, if he thought it had been suppressed for the wrong reasons, he might have wanted to preserve it. And if he felt threatened or unsafe, hiding it somewhere unexpected would make sense." "In a car," Jarrett said quietly. "In a car that eventually ended up in Dale Pritchard's salvage yard, where you bought it for $50. Margaret smiled, but there was something serious beneath it. "Jarrett, this could be significant. Not just historically, though it certainly is that, but in terms of understanding how energy policy was shaped in the 70s. There are people who study these things, who would be very interested in what you found." "Like who?" "Well, for starters, Ben Torres at the Timber Creek Historical Society. He's an archivist, good at research, and he has connections to state preservation boards. If anyone could help us understand the full context of this and figure out what should be done with it, it's Ben." Jarrett felt the weight of decision settling on him. Part of him wanted to pack everything back in the box, hide it away, pretend he'd never found it. Life was complicated enough without, adding mysteries from 50 years ago. But another part, a part that had been dormant for months, maybe years, felt awake for the first time in longer than he could remember. This mattered. He didn't fully understand why yet, but he could feel it. Dr. Sarah Vance had worked on something important, and someone had made sure it disappeared. Her brother had tried to preserve it, and maybe paid a price for that. Now, by pure accident, it had landed in Jarrett's hands. He thought of Emma's drawing on his dashboard. Thought about being someone his daughter could be proud of again, thought about purpose and meaning and the possibility that even from rock bottom you could still reach up and touch something that mattered. "Okay," he said. "Let's talk to Ben Torres." Margaret's smile widened. "I was hoping you'd say that. But Jarrett, one more thing. That last document you showed me, the one mentioning people who don't like old secrets surfacing, I wasn't making that up as a general observation. There's a reason some projects stay buried. If we pursue this, if we start asking questions and drawing attention to materials that someone clearly wanted hidden, we might find that not everyone is happy about it. Are you saying this could be dangerous? I'm saying we should be careful, but I'm also saying some things are worth the risk." She gathered the documents back into neat stacks. "Let me call Ben, see when he can meet with us. In the meantime, you should keep this somewhere safe." Jarrett nodded, closing the lockbox. As he did, he noticed something he'd missed before: scratches on the metal surface that might have been random, or might have been words, worn almost smooth by time and handling. He tilted it toward the light, trying to make them out. "Keep the light alive." Margaret saw them too. She touched the words gently. Sarah's work was about solar energy, about light. Maybe that's literal, or maybe it means something more. Either way, Jarrett thought, carrying the box back out into the bright morning, he intended to find out. Ben Torres worked out of a converted house on Maple Street that served as the Timber Creek Historical Society. The building was a century-old Victorian that had once belonged to a lumber baron, now filled with filing cabinets, archival boxes, and the particular smell of old paper that every historical collection acquires. Ben himself was in his mid-50s, compact and energetic, with reading glasses perpetually perched on top of his head and ink stains on his fingers from handling old documents. Margaret had called ahead, so Ben was expecting them when Jarrett arrived the next morning. The archivist met them at the door with coffee already brewing and a workspace cleared on a large oak table that dominated what had once been a dining room. "Margaret says you found something interesting," Ben said, gesturing for Jarrett to set the lockbox down. "I've got to admit, when she described it, I got excited. We don't get a lot of genuine historical discoveries around here. Mostly it's people bringing in their grandfather's logging equipment or old property deeds." Jarrett opened the box and watched Ben's expression shift from polite interest to focused intensity as he examined the contents. The archivist handled everything with care. Using cotton gloves he pulled from a drawer, studying each document like it was a piece of art. "Project Helios," Ben murmured, reading through the papers. "This is new to me, and I thought I knew every government program that touched the Pacific Northwest in the 70s. He looked up at Jarrett. "You said you found this in a car? Tell me everything about how you acquired it." Jarrett explained the purchase from Dale, the discovery in the trunk, the condition of the materials. Ben listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes on a pad. "The preservation is remarkable," Ben said. "Whoever hid this knew what they were doing. That canvas wrap, the placement under the tire for climate stability. This was hidden by someone who understood archival protection." He picked up one of the film canisters. Margaret said, "You've already viewed these?" "Yesterday, at the library. They show a desert facility, solar panels, scientists at work, and then everything being dismantled." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "Let me cross-reference what we have here with our newspaper archives. If Project Helios was a government energy program, even a classified one, there might be mentions in contemporary reporting. The 70s were a big time for energy policy because of the oil embargo. Lots of federal programs got started and stopped." He moved to a row of filing cabinets along one wall, pulling out folders filled with newspaper clippings organized by year. "We've got the Timber Creek Gazette going back to 1892, plus we archive the major Oregon papers and some national publications. If there's anything about alternative energy programs in the early 70s, it'll be here." For the next 2 hours, they worked through the archives. Margaret searched online databases, Ben combed through physical newspapers, and Jarrett read through the Project Helios documents more systematically, making lists of names and dates. The coffee pot emptied and was refilled. Around noon, Ben made a small sound of discovery. Here, Oregonian, August 1972. Small article, bottom of page 6. He read aloud. Federal funding announced for renewable energy research initiatives. Projects include solar, wind, and geothermal studies at facilities in Nevada, New Mexico, and California. Dr. Sarah Vance of Berkeley will lead solar research under the newly designated Project Helios. So it was real, Jarrett said. Not just something hidden away, but an actual public program. Initially, yes. Ben pulled more clippings. Here's another from October 72. Brief mention in a science column about promising developments in photovoltaic technology. And then he paused, reading, ahead silently. Then nothing for almost a year. No follow-up stories, no progress reports. That's unusual. Federal programs usually generate regular press, especially if they're showing results. Margaret looked up from her laptop. I found congressional testimony from 1974. There was a hearing on energy policy after the oil crisis. Project Helios is mentioned, but only in passing. A senator asked about its status, and the response was that it had been concluded and archived due to budgetary constraints. But here's what's interesting. There's a note that several pages of testimony were removed from the public record for national security reasons. What kind of solar energy research would involve national security? Jarrett asked. That's the question, isn't it? Ben set down the newspaper clippings and picked up one of the technical documents from the lockbox. I'm not a scientist, but I've handled enough research papers to recognize when something is significant. These efficiency numbers, even to a layman, they look extraordinary. If this technology was actually achieving these results in 1972, it would have been decades ahead of commercial solar panels. He walked to a bookshelf and pulled down a volume about energy history. Flipping through it, he found a chart showing the development of solar panel efficiency over time. Look at this. Commercial panels in the 70s were achieving maybe 8 to 10% efficiency. By the 90s, that had improved to 15%. Modern panels might reach 22% on a good day. He tapped the Project Helios documents. These reports claim they were hitting 35% consistently, with peaks above 40%. In 1972, the room fell quiet as they absorbed the implications. If that's true, Margaret said slowly, this wasn't just ahead of its time, it was revolutionary. And someone shut it down, Jarrett added. The question is why? Ben returned to his historical records, this time pulling out materials about the 1973 oil crisis. Context matters here. October 73, OPEC announced an oil embargo against countries supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Prices quadrupled. Gas lines, rationing, economic panic. You'd think that would be the perfect moment for alternative energy to get massive support, unless, Margaret said, the people with power had other priorities. Ben found more documents, testimony from oil company executives arguing against government interference in energy markets, lobbying records showing substantial pressure on congressional committees, opinion pieces warning about the economic disruption of rapid transitions away from fossil fuels. There was a battle happening, Ben said, laying out the materials like puzzle pieces. On one side, scientists and some policymakers who saw the crisis as an opportunity to invest in alternatives. On the other, established industries and their allies who saw alternative energy as a threat to their business model. And the oil crisis actually made that threat feel more urgent to them. Jarrett thought about Dr. Sarah Vance working in that desert facility, achieving breakthroughs that could have changed everything, only to have her project shut down. So they killed it. The project, I mean. It appears so, Ben pulled out another folder, this one containing biographical information he'd compiled from various sources. And here's where it gets more personal. Dr. Sarah Vance died 2 years after Project Helios was terminated. She was 48. The obituary says heart attack, but look at this. He showed them a letter to the editor from 1975, written by Robert Vance. Her brother publicly questioned the circumstances of her death. He wrote that she'd been in excellent health, that she'd told him she was under pressure to destroy her research notes, that she'd feared for her safety. "Did anyone investigate?" Jarrett asked. "Not that I can find." And then Robert Vance himself disappeared in 1976. Ben met Jarrett's eyes. "The car you bought, do you know anything about its history before the salvage yard?" "Dale said he got it at auction a couple years ago." "That's all I know." Ben made a note. "I can trace vehicle registrations through the DMV historical records. It takes time, but it's possible. If Robert Vance owned that car, if he hid these materials and then disappeared, that would tell us something important about what he feared and why he thought preservation mattered more than coming forward." Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at Maple Street. "We're talking about the possibility that a significant scientific advance was deliberately suppressed for economic reasons, and that the people involved in that suppression might have gone to extreme lengths to make sure it stayed buried. That's not just history, that's conspiracy. Or it's a tragic story about promising research that got caught up in political and economic forces," Ben said. "We don't know enough yet to make those kinds of claims. What we do know is that Jarrett has found materials of clear historical value that deserve proper investigation and preservation." Jarrett had been quiet, listening to them piece together the story. Now he spoke. "What happens next?" Ben considered. "We need expert analysis of the technical documents. I know a retired physicist, Dr. Raymond Cole, who consults for universities sometimes. He could tell us if these efficiency claims are credible or if we're misunderstanding what we're looking at. We should also try to contact any living relatives of Dr. Vance. And we need to properly archive these materials, make copies, ensure nothing gets lost." "And if it turns out this really was suppressed?" Jarrett asked. "If we confirm that this technology could have made a difference and someone deliberately buried it, then," Ben said carefully, "we have a responsibility to make that information public. But we do it right, documented, verified, credible. Not wild accusations, but solid historical research." Margaret returned to the table. "Jarrett, you need to understand something. If we pursue this, if what we suspect is even partially true, there might be people who would prefer these materials stayed lost. 50 years is a long time, but institutions have long memories, and there's still money and power tied up in energy policy." Jarrett thought about his daughter, about the life he was trying to rebuild, about the risks of drawing attention when you had nothing to protect you. But he also thought about Dr. Sarah Vance, working in that desert facility on something that mattered, believing in progress and innovation, only to be stopped by forces that valued profit over possibility. "I found this for a reason," he said. "Maybe it was just luck, maybe it was something else. But I found it, and now I know what it is. I can't just put it back in a trunk and pretend I don't." Ben smiled. "Then we keep going. Carefully, methodically, but we keep going." They spent the rest of the afternoon making detailed inventories and careful copies of everything in the lockbox. Ben had archival equipment that could photograph each document without damaging it. Margaret created a digital catalogue of the materials. Jarrett watched them work, feeling something shift inside him, the sense that he was part of something larger than his own survival, that purpose could emerge from the most unexpected places. As evening approached and they prepared to leave, Ben handed Jarrett a business card. "Keep the originals somewhere safe, not in the car, somewhere more secure, and stay in touch. I'll reach out to Dr. Cole tomorrow, see if he's willing to consult." Walking back through the quiet streets of Timber Creek, the lockbox once again under his arm, Jarrett felt the weight of responsibility settling alongside the weight of the metal. He was no longer just a homeless man trying to survive. He was a guardian of something important, a keeper of secrets that deserved to see light. The Mercury sat waiting in the salvage yard, rust and all. Jarrett climbed inside, set the lockbox in the passenger seat, and sat in the growing darkness. Somewhere out there, decades ago, Dr. Sarah Vance had worked on something that could have changed the world. Her brother had tried to preserve it. And now, by pure chance or fate, it had landed in the hands of a broke single father who'd lost everything. Maybe, Jarrett thought, that was exactly who was supposed to find it. Dr. Raymond Cole lived in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Timber Creek, surrounded by gardens that his late wife had planted, and he still maintained with devoted care. He was 73, long retired from Portland State University where he'd taught physics for 4 decades, and he answered his door wearing reading glasses and a cardigan with elbow patches that looked genuinely worn rather than fashionably distressed. "Ben Torres called," he said, ushering Jarrett and Margaret inside. "Said you had something that would interest me." I told him I'm retired and mostly interested in my tomatoes these days, but he was persistent. His eyes found the lockbox Jarrett carried. "I assume that's it?" They settled in, Doctor. Cole's study, a room lined floor to ceiling with books and filled with the comfortable clutter of a long academic career. Jarrett opened the lockbox and laid out the technical documents. "Doctor." Cole put on a different pair of glasses, these with thicker lenses, and began to read. The transformation was immediate. His casual demeanor shifted to intense focus as he moved through the papers, occasionally making small sounds, a hum of interest, a sharp intake of breath, once a whispered, "Remarkable." 20 minutes passed in silence, while Margaret and Jarrett waited. Finally, Doctor. Cole set down the last page and removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly while he gathered his thoughts. "Where did you get these?" he asked. Jarrett explained again about the car, the trunk, the discovery. Dr. Cole listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. "What you've found," the physicist said carefully, "is documentation of work that shouldn't have been possible in 1972. Not impossible, understand the physics were theoretically sound, even then. But the materials science, the manufacturing precision, the engineering required to achieve these results that shouldn't have existed yet." "But it did exist?" Margaret asked. "According to these documents, yes. And if I'm reading this correctly, Dr. Vance wasn't just ahead of her time by a few years. She was ahead by decades." He picked up a page covered in equations and diagrams. "Modern solar panels work by converting photons from sunlight into electrical current using semiconductor materials. The efficiency depends on how much of the sun's spectrum you can capture and convert. Current commercial panels top out around 22% efficiency because of fundamental limitations in the materials we use." He tapped the Project Helios specifications. "Dr. Vance appears to have developed a multi-junction design using materials I don't entirely recognize from the chemical formulas here. But the principle is sound layer different semiconductor materials to capture different wavelengths of light. We do this now in very expensive space applications." She was doing it in 1972, and according to these test results, achieving sustained efficiency rates of 35% with peak performance above 40%. Jarrett leaned forward. "What would that have meant if this technology had been developed back then?" Dr. Cole stood and walked to his window, looking out at his garden where the afternoon sun slanted through the trees. The oil crisis hit in 1973. Gas prices went through the roof, the economy contracted, people waited in line for hours to fill their tanks. There was genuine fear about energy security, about America's dependence on foreign oil. If solar technology with this kind of efficiency had been available then, if it had been scaled up and deployed, it wouldn't have solved everything overnight. But it could have changed the trajectory of energy policy for the next 50 years. "Why didn't it?" Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. These documents show the project was terminated in November 1973, right in the middle of the crisis when you'd think funding would increase. Dr. Cole returned to his chair. The official reason given is budgetary reallocation, but the budget numbers here show Project Helios was relatively inexpensive compared to other energy programs at the time. There's something else in these memos that's interesting. References to concerns about market stability and industry disruption. Someone was worried about what this would do to oil companies, Jarrett said, or coal or natural gas or electric utilities, any established energy interest. Revolutionary solar technology in the 70s would have threatened enormous amounts of invested capital and political influence. Dr. Cole's expression was troubled. I want to be careful about making accusations without evidence, but I've been in academia long enough to know that promising research gets killed for non-scientific reasons more often than the public realizes. Usually it's more subtle than this. Funding gradually dries up, researchers get discouraged, projects die quietly. An abrupt termination like this of work that was clearly producing results that suggests direct intervention. He picked up another document, this one showing test data from the solar panels. I'd need to see the actual film footage Ben mentioned to be certain, but based on these numbers and the methodology described, I believe Dr. Vance's work was genuine. This wasn't theoretical research or optimistic projections. She built functioning prototypes and tested them rigorously. This was real. The weight of that confirmation settled over the room. Jarrett thought about the implications, not just historical, but personal. Dr. Vance had created something that could have helped millions of people reduce their energy costs, reduce dependence on fossil fuels, reduce the environmental impact that everyone was so concerned about now. And it had been taken away from her, buried, erased. What happened to her? Dr. Cole asked. Dr. Vance, I mean. She died in 1975, Margaret said. Heart attack, officially. Her brother questioned the circumstances, then disappeared himself a year later. Dr. Cole was quiet for a long moment. That's a tragic story. And not uncommon, unfortunately. Science has always been tangled up with politics and economics. Researchers who threaten the wrong interests sometimes find their careers destroyed, usually not their lives. But he trailed off, looking at the documents spread across his desk. I don't want to speculate about things I can't prove. What would you need to prove it? Jarrett asked. Or at least to make a strong case that this was real and was deliberately suppressed. The physical prototype would be ideal, but that's almost certainly long gone. The film footage would help. Visual documentation is powerful. Beyond that, we'd need to trace the decision-making process. Who specifically ordered the project terminated? What pressure was applied, and by whom? Congressional testimony, internal government memos, anything showing the real reasons behind the shutdown. Dr. Cole spread his hands. That kind of information might still be classified, or it might have been destroyed. 50 years is a long time. But some records survive, Ben said from the doorway. They all turned, none of them had heard him arrive. Sorry, door was open. I found something at the courthouse I thought you should see right away. Ben entered, carrying a folder. I traced the vehicle registration like I said I would. The Mercury was owned by Robert Vance from 1974 until 1976, when it was towed from a Forest Service road and eventually sold at auction. But that's not the interesting part. I also searched property records for the Vance family. He opened the folder on the desk. Robert Vance had a storage unit in his name at a facility outside Eugene. The rental was paid through an automated trust fund established in 1976. The unit is still active, still being paid for, and according to the facility's records, it's never been opened since it was rented. The implications hung in the air like electricity before a storm. He hid more than just what was in the car, Margaret said softly. That would be my guess. Ben looked at Jarrett. The question is whether we want to find out what else he preserved, and whether we're prepared for what that might mean. Doctor. Cole gathered the documents carefully, treating them with the reverence they deserved. I'll write up my analysis of these technical specifications. If you're going to pursue this, you'll need credible expert testimony that the science was sound. But I want to say something first. He looked at each of them in turn. I spent my career teaching students that science should serve humanity, that knowledge should be shared, that truth matters more than profit. If what you've found is evidence that those principles were violated, that genuine innovation was suppressed for economic gain, then I believe it should be brought to light. But I also know that challenging powerful interests can have consequences. Make sure you understand what you're getting into. Jarrett thought about his daughter, about the precarious stability of his life, about how easy it would be to simply hand everything over to someone else and walk away. But he also thought about Dr. Sarah Vance, working in that desert laboratory, believing she was contributing something valuable to the world, only to have it taken away. About her brother trying to preserve her legacy at who knows what cost to himself. Some things were worth the risk. Some truths demanded to be told, regardless of who found them inconvenient. I understand, Jarrett said, and I'm going to see this through. The drive to Eugene took 3 hours. Ben drove his aging Subaru, while Jarrett sat in the passenger seat watching Oregon's autumn landscape roll past. Margaret had stayed behind to continue research, and Dr. Cole was working on his technical analysis. It was just the two of them, heading toward whatever Robert Vance had locked away nearly 50 years ago. "You nervous?" Ben asked as they merged onto the interstate. "Should I be?" "Probably. We're about to open something that's been sealed for half a century. Either it's going to be important, or it's going to be a huge anti-climax. Not sure which would be worse." The storage facility was called Secure Space, a sprawling complex of orange doors and concrete corridors on the industrial edge of Eugene. The manager was a woman in her 30s named Patricia, who seemed both curious and slightly suspicious about their interest in a unit that had been untouched for decades. "The trust pays automatically," she explained, pulling up records on her computer. "We've sent notification letters to the trustee address over the years, mostly about rate increases, but nobody's ever responded. Legally, as long as the payment's clear, we keep the unit sealed." She looked at Ben. "You said you have authorization?" Ben showed her the documentation he'd obtained. He'd tracked down the law firm managing the trust, explained the situation, and gotten permission to access the unit for historical research purposes. It had taken several phone calls and some creative explanation, but eventually they'd agreed. Patricia led them through the facility, their footsteps echoing off concrete. Unit 247 was in the back corner, its orange door identical to hundreds of others, except for the layer of dust that suggested long neglect. "I'll need to verify the lock code," Patricia said, consulting. Her tablet, she entered a sequence on the electronic keypad. Nothing happened. She tried again, frowning. "That's odd. Let me try the master override." On the third attempt, something clicked, and the door unlocked. Patricia pulled it up, revealing darkness beyond. "I'll leave you to it," she said. "Facility rules say I should supervise, but honestly, I've got paperwork piling up. Just lock up when you're done and stop by the office." She handed Ben a temporary access card and left. Ben found a light switch inside the door. Fluorescent tubes flickered to life, revealing a 10 by 10 space packed with careful organization. Metal shelving units lined the walls, and in the center sat a filing cabinet and several sealed plastic storage containers. "He was methodical," Jarrett said, stepping inside. Everything was labeled in neat handwriting, dates, categories, cross-references. This wasn't someone hiding things in a panic. This was someone building an archive. They started with the filing cabinet. The top drawer contained correspondence letters Robert Vance had written to congressmen, to energy officials, to newspaper editors. Most were dated 1974 and 1975, after Project Helios had been terminated. The letters were passionate but controlled, laying out concerns about research suppression, asking questions about his sister's work, demanding transparency. The responses, when there were any, were form letters thanking him for his interest and assuring him that all government programs followed appropriate procedures. The second drawer held financial records, bank statements showing large withdrawals, receipts for equipment purchases, payment records to private investigators. Robert Vance had spent a considerable amount of money trying to find answers about what had happened to his sister's project. He hired investigators, Ben noted, examining receipts. 3 different firms, over 18 months. He was serious about this. The third drawer made them both go quiet. Medical records for Sarah Vance, obtained from her personal physician. Notes from appointments in 1974 and early 1975, describing her as healthy, active, no history of heart problems. And then a different document, a private autopsy report commissioned by Robert after his sister's death. Jarrett read it carefully. The private pathologist had found the official cause of death, heart attack, to be medically questionable given Sarah's health history. There were irregularities in the tissue samples that suggested possible toxic exposure, though nothing definitive. The pathologist had recommended further investigation. There was no evidence that recommendation had been followed. Ben, Jarrett said quietly, I think he really believed his sister was murdered. Ben was opening one of the plastic containers. Inside, wrapped in protective material, was another lockbox larger than the one from the car. He lifted it carefully onto the top of the filing cabinet and opened it. Inside was a leather-bound journal, dozens of loose papers, and something wrapped in cloth. Ben unwrapped it carefully, revealing a rectangular object about the size of a hardcover book, its surface covered in what looked like a complex array of dark crystalline material. Is that? Jarrett started. A solar panel, Ben finished, or part of one, an actual physical prototype from Project Helios. They stared at it. This wasn't just documentation anymore. This was physical evidence, something that could be tested, verified, proven. Dr. Vance's work made tangible. Ben carefully set it aside and picked up the journal. The handwriting inside matched the labels on the boxes, Robert Vance's meticulous script. He documented everything, his sister's concerns in the months before her death, his own investigation after, the obstacles he'd encountered, the threats he'd received. One entry from March 1976 stood out. They made it clear today that continuing puts my family at risk. I can't stop entirely, but I can't endanger the people I love. Solution: preserve everything, hide it where it might eventually be found by someone without my attachments, someone who might have the freedom to act that I don't. The car is registered to a shell entity, will be abandoned where hikers occasionally go but authorities rarely patrol. Might take years. Might take decades, but someday, someone will find it. He planned this, Jarrett said, the car, the lockbox, all of it. He knew someone would eventually buy it and discover what he'd hidden. And he put the most important materials here, in storage, as a backup. Ben continued reading through the journal. Listen to this. Sarah's prototype is more valuable than all the papers combined. It proves the technology worked. If her designs are ever to be vindicated, someone needs to be able to demonstrate that these weren't just theoretical calculations. She built something real that functioned exactly as she claimed. They spent 2 hours cataloging everything in the storage unit. More technical documents, correspondence with other scientists who'd worked on Project Helios, financial records showing funding cuts, and most damning, internal memos. Robert had somehow obtained documents that showed energy industry lobbyists had explicitly pressured the Department of Energy to terminate the project. One memo was particularly clear. Project Helios represents a potential disruption to market stability. While the technology shows promise, rapid deployment could undermine existing infrastructure investments and create uncertainty in the energy sector. Recommend suspension pending further economic impact assessment. It was dated October 1973, just weeks before the project was officially terminated. Economic impact assessment, Ben said bitterly. That's code for this threatens the wrong people's profits. The last container held something unexpected, a videotape, labeled simply, Insurance, May 1976. Ben held it up. We need to see what's on this. They locked the unit and returned to Patricia's office, asking if there was any way to view the tape. She looked doubtful, but made a phone call. 20 minutes later, a maintenance worker appeared with an old VCR he'd retrieved from a basement storage room. They set it up in a break room, and Ben slid the tape into the machine. The video was grainy, shot on what looked like a home camera. It showed Robert Vance sitting in what was probably his living room, looking tired and frightened. "My name is Robert Vance," his recorded voice said. "It's the 15th of May, 1976. I'm making this recording because I believe my life may be in danger, and I want there to be a record of what I know and why." For the next 20 minutes, Robert laid out everything: his sister's work, the suspicious circumstances of her death, the threats he'd received, the evidence he'd gathered. He named names, cited specific instances of intimidation, and explained his decision to hide the materials and disappear. "If you're watching this," Robert said at the end, his image frozen in pixels and magnetic tape, "then you've found what I preserved. Please don't let my sister's work be forgotten. Please make sure the truth comes out. Some things are more important than safety. Some things are worth the risk." The tape ended. The room was silent, except for the hum of the old VCR. Jarrett thought about his daughter, about his precarious life, about all the reasons to walk away. But he also thought about the Vance siblings, both gone now, both having sacrificed so much to preserve a truth they believed mattered. "We take everything," he said. "We document it, we verify it, and we make it public. That's what Robert wanted. That's what Dr. Vance deserved." Ben nodded slowly. "Then that's what we'll do. But Jarrett, after this, there's no going back. Once we start making this public, we're committed." "I know," Jarrett said. "I'm ready." They loaded everything into Ben's car, careful to keep the continuations prototype protected. As they drove back to Timber Creek, the sun setting behind them, Jarrett felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper. He was no longer just a man who'd stumbled onto something interesting. He was now the keeper of evidence that could rewrite history, and he had no intention of letting it stay buried any longer. Margaret had news when they returned. "I've found her," she said before they'd even finished unloading Ben's car. "Dr. Sarah Vance's granddaughter. Her name is Claire Vance. She's 52, and she lives in Portland. I called her this afternoon and explained what you'd found. She wants to talk to you." The video call was scheduled for the next evening at the library where Margaret had set up a laptop with a stable connection. Claire Vance appeared on screen promptly at 7, a woman with her grandmother's dark eyes and determined expression, sitting in a home office with bookshelves visible behind her. "I never thought I'd see anything from Project Helios again," she said after introductions. "My grandmother died when my mother was only 23. I grew up hearing stories about her work, about how brilliant she was, how passionate about making solar energy accessible to everyone. But we had so little documentation. Most of her papers disappeared after she died. Your Uncle Robert preserved them," Jarrett said, and proceeded to explain everything they'd found: the car, the storage unit, the prototype, the evidence of suppression. Claire's composure cracked. Tears ran down her face as she listened. "Uncle Robert vanished when I was just a baby. My mother always believed something terrible had happened to him, but there was never any proof, never any closure. To know that he did this, that he protected her legacy." She paused, collecting herself. "I need to see these materials." "Of course," Ben said. "But first, we wanted to ask what you knew about your grandmother's death and your uncle's disappearance. Claire nodded. My mother told me everything when I was old enough to understand. Grandma Sarah had been complaining in her final months that she was being followed, that her lab had been searched, that people were pressuring her to destroy certain research notes. The family thought it was stress, maybe paranoia. Then she died suddenly. Uncle Robert never believed it was natural. He spent 2 years investigating, and then one day he was just gone. Left his apartment, his job, everything. The family filed a missing persons report, but nothing came of it. She reached off screen and held up a photograph. This is the only picture I have of them together. The image showed a younger Sarah Vance with her arm around a man in his 30s, Robert, clearly, with the same careful eyes that had documented everything in that storage unit. Uncle Robert left my mother a letter, Claire continued. It arrived 3 weeks after he disappeared. He said he loved her, that he was sorry, but that he had to go away to keep the family safe. He said someday the truth would come out, and when it did, we should be proud of what Grandma Sarah had tried to do. Margaret spoke gently. Claire, we're planning to make all of this public, the documents, the prototype, the evidence of suppression. But we wanted your family's blessing first. This is your grandmother's legacy. You have it, Claire said immediately. Absolutely, you have it. Grandma Sarah believed that science should serve humanity, not profit margins. If her work was suppressed for economic reasons, people need to know. The world needs to know what was possible 50 years ago and what we lost. She wiped her eyes. When can I see the materials? They arranged for Claire to visit Timber Creek the following weekend. After the call ended, Jarrett sat quietly in the library's empty conference room. The story was taking shape now, becoming real in a way it hadn't been before. These weren't just historical artifacts anymore. They represented real people, a brilliant scientist whose work had been stolen from her, a brother who'd sacrificed everything to preserve her legacy, a family that had lived with loss and questions for half a century. That night, sleeping in the Mercury, with the prototype locked in Frank's hardware store safe, Jarrett's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Albee? The voice was professional, male, careful. My name is David Chen. I represent certain interests that have become aware of your recent activities regarding historical energy research. I'd like to meet with you to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement. Who are you? Jarrett asked, suddenly wide awake. Let's just say I work for people who understand that historical research can sometimes raise unnecessary complications. My clients are prepared to offer you substantial compensation for the materials you've acquired, along with a consulting fee for your time and discretion. Shall we say $500,000? Jarrett's heart pounded. $500,000 would solve every problem in his life. He could get an apartment, establish stable custody with Emma, never worry about where his next meal was coming from. The materials aren't for sale, he heard himself say. A pause. Mr. Albee, I don't think you understand your situation. You're a homeless man with a criminal record. I don't have a criminal record. You will have one if certain information comes to light. DUI from 10 years ago that was expunged, employment history that could be interpreted as fraud, questions about your fitness as a parent. I'm offering you a way to avoid complications and improve your life substantially. I suggest you take it. The threat was clear beneath the professional veneer. Jarrett thought about Emma, about the fragile progress he'd made, about how easy it would be to lose everything again, but he also thought about Dr. Vance working in that desert laboratory, about Robert Vance hiding evidence and fleeing into obscurity, about Claire's tears as she learned her uncle had protected her grandmother's legacy. I said no. Don't call again. He hung up and sat in the dark car, hands shaking. Within minutes his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Think carefully about your daughter. That was it. That was the line they'd crossed. Jarrett forwarded the text to Ben with a message. They're threatening Emma. We need to move faster. The response came immediately. Come to my office first thing tomorrow. We accelerate the timeline. Jared didn't sleep the rest of that night. He sat in the Mercury watching the shadows, thinking about threats and consequences and the price of doing what was right. By dawn, he'd made his decision. They would go public immediately, release everything at once so it couldn't be suppressed or stolen. It was the only way to protect both the truth and the people trying to tell it. Some things were worth fighting for, even when you had everything to lose. The office was crowded the next morning. Margaret sat at the research table with her laptop, Doctor. Cole reviewed technical documents, and Claire Vance had driven down from Portland overnight after Jared called her about the threats. Frank Donnelly was there too, having closed his hardware store for the morning after Jared explained the situation. "We can't wait," Jared said, showing them the text message. "They're threatening my daughter. That means we're out of time for careful preparation. We go public now, before they can stop us." "Agreed," Claire said immediately. "But we do it right. Multiple channels simultaneously so they can't contain it." Dr. Cole nodded. "I've finished my technical analysis. The prototype functions exactly as the documents claim. I tested it yesterday with equipment borrowed from the university. The efficiency rates are genuine 37% sustained output under standard test conditions. That's revolutionary, even by today's standards, let alone for 1972 technology. I've contacted Julia Santos at the Oregonian," Margaret added. "She's been following our research and wants to break the story. I also reached out to the Portland Tribune and a freelance journalist who covers energy policy for national outlets. They're all interested." Ben spread out a timeline on the table. "Here's what I propose. We hold a press conference at the Historical Society in 3 days. That gives us time to prepare comprehensive documentation packages, make backup copies of everything, and coordinate with the journalists. We announce the discovery, present the evidence, and release all materials simultaneously online, so they're immediately public domain." 3 days is too long," Jared said. "What if they try something before then?" Frank spoke up for the first time. "Then we make sure everything is protected starting now. I've got a safe at the store that's more secure than anything they're expecting. We put the originals there. We make multiple digital copies and store them in different locations. Cloud storage, physical drives, sent to trusted people out of state. By tonight, this information exists in so many places that no single action can suppress it. And we contact the police about the threats," Claire added. "Get it on record. If something happens to any of us, there's documentation of intimidation." They worked through the morning with focused intensity. Dr. Cole prepared his technical report with detailed photographs of the prototype and test results. Margaret compiled a comprehensive historical timeline with sources cited for every claim. Ben organized the documents from the storage unit into a coherent narrative. Claire scanned family photographs and wrote a personal account of her grandmother's life and work. Jared's role was different. Ben suggested he write his own story, how he'd found the materials, what the discovery had meant to him, why he believed it mattered. "People connect with personal narratives," Ben explained. "The technical and historical evidence is crucial, but your story makes it human. It shows that important discoveries can come from unexpected places, that truth-telling isn't reserved for the powerful." "So," Jared wrote, "he described being homeless, buying the car for shelter, finding the lockbox. He wrote about his daughter and his desire to be someone she could be proud of. He wrote about Dr. Vance's lost innovations and Robert's sacrifice. He tried to make people understand why this mattered, not just as history, but as a reminder that progress could be deliberately blocked when it threatened the wrong interests." By afternoon, they had assembled a comprehensive package. Julia Santos arrived to review the materials and conduct interviews. She was in her 40s, skeptical by profession but clearly moved by what she saw. "This is major," she said, after examining everything. "Not just the technology, but the evidence of deliberate suppression. When you're showing me is accurate, and it appears to be..." This is a story about how innovation gets killed when it challenges established power. That's always relevant. She interviewed each of them, recording everything. When she spoke with Jarrett, she asked about the threats. "Are you afraid?" "Yes," he admitted, "but I'm more afraid of teaching my daughter that you back down when telling the truth gets difficult. I want her to know that her father found something important and did the right thing with it, even when it would have been easier not to." Julia nodded, making notes. "I'll have the story ready for the morning edition, the day of your press conference. And I'm going to reach out to some national contacts. This deserves broader coverage." After she left, they discussed security. Frank offered to let Jarrett stay in the apartment above his hardware store. "It's empty, and it's got a good lock. You shouldn't be sleeping in a car right now, not with people making threats," Claire surprised them all by offering to stay in Timber Creek until after the press conference. "This is my grandmother's legacy. I want to be here to defend it." That evening, Jarrett moved into the apartment above Donnelly Hardware. It was small, just a bedroom, bathroom and kitchenette, but it felt like a palace after months in a tent and a week in the car. Frank had furnished it simply: a bed, a table, a chair, a lamp. Everything Jarrett needed, and nothing he didn't. "Thank you," Jarrett said, meaning it for more than just the apartment. Frank waved it off. "You're doing something brave. Least I can do is give you a safe place to do it from." Alone that night, Jarrett called Emma. Angela answered, her voice wary. "I need to talk to Emma," he said. "Just for a few minutes." There was a pause, then Emma's voice. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, sweetheart. I know I haven't been around much lately, and I'm sorry for that, but I want you to know I'm working on something important, something that might make a difference for a lot of people. Mum said you're causing trouble. I'm telling the truth about something people tried to hide. Sometimes that looks like trouble to people who'd rather keep things hidden." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Emma, when you're older, I want you to be able to look back at this time and know that your dad tried to do what was right, even when it was hard. Can you understand that?" A long silence. Then, "I think so. Are you going to be okay?" "I am, I promise. And maybe soon things will be better. Maybe I'll have a real place for you to visit." "I'd like that." After they hung up, Jarrett sat by the window, watching Timber Creek's quiet streets. In 3 days, everything would change. The story would be public, the evidence released, the truth about Project Helios finally brought to light after 50 years of burial. He thought about Dr. Vance in her laboratory, believing her work would help people, about Robert hiding the evidence and disappearing to protect it, about Claire growing up with questions and loss, about all the ways that powerful interests had shaped history by choosing what innovations to allow and which to suppress. And he thought about himself, a broke, homeless single father who'd bought a $50 car and found something that mattered. Maybe that was how truth usually emerged, not through official channels, but through accidents and persistence, through ordinary people who decided that some things were worth the risk. 3 more days. Then the world would know. The morning of the press conference arrived with unexpected rain, a steady Oregon downpour that turned Timber Creek's streets into mirrors reflecting grey sky. Jarrett woke early in the apartment above the hardware store, nervous energy making sleep impossible. Today, everything would become public. There would be no going back. Ben had arranged for the press conference to be held at the Historical Society at 2 in the afternoon. They'd invited local media, sent press releases to regional outlets, and contacted state officials. Dr. Cole had prepared a demonstration of the prototype. Claire had flown in her mother, Sarah Vance's daughter, who wanted to be present when her mother's work was finally acknowledged. But first, there was one more complication to handle. At 8 in the morning, a man in an expensive suit appeared at the hardware store. Frank called Jarrett down from the apartment. The man introduced himself as Thomas Bradley, senior counsel for an energy consortium whose member companies had been involved in federal energy policy during the 1970 seconds. "Mr. Albee," Bradley said, his tone professionally cordial, I'm here to make you a final offer before you do something you'll regret." They stood in the hardware store's office. Frank present as a witness. Bradley opened a briefcase and removed a check already made out to Jarrett Albee for $500,000. "This is yours," Bradley said, "in exchange for all materials related to Project Helios and your agreement to sign a confidentiality agreement. You keep the money, we take possession of historical documents that rightfully belong to the federal government, and everyone moves forward. You get your life back, your daughter gets her father back. Clean, simple, beneficial to everyone." Jarrett looked at the check. $500,000. He could see Emma regularly, provide for her, give her the stability she deserved. He could have a real home, a real life. Everything he'd lost could be rebuilt. "What about the truth?" he asked quietly. "The truth is that you found some old papers that are historically interesting but ultimately irrelevant to modern policy. Solar technology has advanced far beyond what Dr. Vance was working on. Making a spectacle of this serves no purpose except to damage reputations and create controversy where none is needed." "And Dr. Vance's death? Robert Vance's disappearance?" Bradley's expression hardened slightly. "Tragic events from 50 years ago that you can't change by spreading unverified conspiracy theories. Mr. Albee, I'm trying to help you. You're a man with nothing, about to pick a fight with people who have everything. That's not brave. That's foolish." Jarrett thought about Emma's drawing in his wallet, about being someone she could be proud of, about Dr. Vance working in that desert facility, believing her innovations would help people, about Robert hiding evidence and disappearing to protect it. "No," he said simply. Bradley's professional mask slipped. "You're making a serious mistake. We've been polite because we hoped you'd be reasonable, but there are other approaches. Your employment history, your fitness as a parent, your credibility, all of it can be destroyed. By tomorrow, you'll be fighting legal battles on multiple fronts, and the materials you've found will be tied up in litigation for years. You'll never see your daughter again. Get out of my store," Frank said, his voice hard. "Now." Bradley stood, gathering his briefcase. "This press conference will be the biggest mistake of your life, Mr. Albee. Remember that you were offered a graceful exit." After he left, Jarrett's hands shook. Frank put a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," the older man said. "I hope so. Because if I'm wrong, I've just destroyed any chance of getting my life back. You already got your life back. That's why you're able to say no." The historical society filled with people as the afternoon approached. Journalists from 4 newspapers, 3 television stations, and several online outlets. State representatives from the Energy and Environmental Committees, officials from the Oregon Historical Preservation Board, local residents who'd heard about the discovery and were curious. Margaret had set up a display of materials, copies of documents, enlarged photographs from the film, and carefully positioned at the center the prototype solar panel under glass. Claire stood with her mother, both of them looking at photographs of Sarah Vance, tears visible but expressions determined. Dr. Cole reviewed his technical presentation one final time. Ben made sure every journalist had received the complete documentation package. Jarrett found a quiet corner and called Emma one more time before everything began. "Dad?" She sounded worried. "Mom said she saw something on the news about you." "I'm about to do something important, sweetheart. I found information about a scientist who invented something amazing 50 years ago, but powerful people made sure nobody ever knew about it. Today, I'm telling her story. It might make some people angry, but it's the truth, and the truth matters. Are you scared? Yes, but I'm doing it anyway, because that's what you do when something is right. I'm proud of you, Dad. Those words meant more than any amount of money. I love you, Emma. I'll call you tonight, okay? Okay. Be brave." At 2:00, Ben called the press conference to order. The room fell silent as he began. "Thank you all for coming. Today, we're revealing a discovery that has significant implications for our understanding of energy policy history and the relationship between scientific innovation and economic interests. In November of last year, Gerrit Albee, a Timber Creek resident, purchased an abandoned vehicle and found materials that had been deliberately hidden, materials related to a federal research program called Project Helios. He outlined the basic facts, then introduced Dr. Cole, who presented his technical analysis. The physicist was clear and precise, explaining in accessible terms why the prototype represented technology decades ahead of its time. This solar panel, built in 1972, achieves efficiency rates that commercial panels didn't match until the 2010 seconds. Dr. Sarah Vance had created a genuine breakthrough in renewable energy technology at a critical moment in American history right before the oil crisis. That defined energy policy for a generation, and that breakthrough was systematically suppressed. Claire spoke next, telling her grandmother's story with emotion but dignity. My grandmother believed science should serve humanity. She died believing her work had failed. Today, we're here to show that she succeeded. What failed wasn't her innovation. It was a system that chose short-term economic interests over long-term progress. Then, it was Gerrit's turn. He walked to the podium, looking out at the cameras and notebooks and faces, and told his story. How he'd lost everything, how he'd found the car, how curiosity had led him to investigate instead of simply selling whatever he'd found. "I'm not a scientist or a historian," he said. "I'm just someone who stumbled onto something important and decided it deserved to be known. Dr. Vance's work matters. The truth about what happened to it matters. And if someone like me can help bring that truth to light, then maybe there's hope that important discoveries don't have to stay buried just because they're inconvenient to powerful people." He finished and stepped back, and the room erupted with questions. The press conference ran for 90 minutes, journalists pressing for details, officials asking about verification, everyone wanting to understand the full implications. Finally, Margaret announced that all materials would be released online within the hour, available to anyone who wanted to examine them. The documentation would be public domain, preserved permanently, impossible to suppress again. As the crowd dispersed, Gerrit stood with his unlikely team, Ben, Margaret, Dr. Cole, Claire, Frank, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Pride, purpose, the knowledge that he'd done something that mattered. Whatever came next, he'd face it knowing he'd made the right choice. The story went national within hours. By evening, Project Helios was trending on social media. News networks picked up the footage from the press conference. Environmental groups issued statements calling for investigations. Energy policy experts appeared on talk shows debating the implications of suppressed innovation. Gerrit watched it unfold from the apartment above the hardware store, his phone buzzing constantly with calls from journalists requesting interviews. Ben had advised him to be selective, to focus on outlets that would treat the story seriously rather than sensationalize it. The backlash came just as quickly. By midnight, a well-funded PR firm had released a statement on behalf of several energy companies questioning the authenticity of the materials. They suggested the documents might be fabricated, that the prototype could be a modern reproduction, that Gerrit's credibility was suspect given his financial situation. "They're trying to make me the story instead of the evidence," Gerrit told Margaret over the phone. "We expected this," she replied calmly. "That's why we released everything, publicly. Any expert can now examine the materials and verify them independently. They can attack you, but they can't hide the truth anymore." She was right. Within 24 hours, 3 independent laboratories had requested access to the prototype for testing. 2 universities announced they were assigning research teams to analyze the technical documents. The National Archives confirmed they had no record of Project Helios materials in their collections, supporting the claim that documentation had been deliberately withheld from preservation. The congressional angle developed faster than anyone expected. A senator from Oregon, who'd built her career on environmental policy, announced hearings into historical energy research suppression. She wanted testimony from everyone involved in the discovery, plus any living former Department of Energy officials who'd been involved in Project Helios. "You'll need to testify," Ben told Jarrett. "Probably in a few weeks. They'll want the first-hand account of finding the materials." The thought of speaking before Congress terrified Jarrett, but he agreed. This was bigger than his comfort now. The personal costs began accumulating too. Angela called, angry and frightened after reporters had shown up at her house asking about Jarrett. "What have you done?" she demanded. "Emma's scared. There are people following us, asking questions about you, about our divorce, about everything. You need to make this stop." "I can't make it stop," Jarrett said, his heart sinking, "but I can make sure Emma's protected. Tell the reporters you have no comment. Don't engage with anyone. I'll call the police and report the harassment. You've destroyed any chance of getting custody back. You know that, right? No judge is going to give visitation to someone who's the center of this kind of controversy." The words hit hard, because they might be true. But backing down now wouldn't change anything. The story was public, the evidence released, the only path was forward. Frank had a different perspective when Jarrett expressed his fears. "You did what you believed was right. Emma's old enough to understand that, even if it takes time. And judges care about fitness, not publicity. You're sober, employed, housed, and you stood up for truth against powerful interests. That's not the profile of an unfit parent." "I'm employed?" Jarrett asked. Frank smiled. "I'm making it official. You've been working for me for months anyway. 20 hours a week to start. Minimum wage plus housing. Not much, but it's steady and legal. Consider it your new job." The gesture moved Jarrett more than he could express. "Thank you" felt inadequate, but it was all he had. By the third day after the press conference, the legal threats began materializing. A law firm representing the Energy Consortium filed suit seeking possession of all Project Helios materials, claiming they were government property that had been improperly removed from federal custody. Another suit alleged that Jarrett had violated laws regarding the handling of classified information. "They're trying to bury you in litigation," the attorney Sarah Kim explained when Ben brought her in to advise. "The cases are weak. The materials were declassified decades ago, and you found them accidentally in property you legally purchased. But they don't need to win. They just need to make fighting so expensive and exhausting that you give up." "I'm not giving up," Jarrett said. "Good, because I'm going to represent you pro bono. This is exactly the kind of case I went to law school hoping to work on. Little guy against corporate interests, truth against power. We'll fight it together." The historical verification continued, strengthening their position. Dr. Cole's technical analysis was peer-reviewed and published in a physics journal. Margaret's historical research was accepted by a university press for publication. The National Archives announced they were opening an investigation into missing Project Helios records. Most significantly, 2 former Department of Energy officials from the 1972nd came forward. Both were retired, both in their 80s, and both confirmed that Project Helios had been producing remarkable results before it was abruptly terminated due to political pressure from energy industry lobbyists. "We were told to archive everything and not discuss it," one of them said in a recorded interview. "I've carried guilt about that for 50 years. Dr. Vance's work could have made a real difference, but we let political considerations override scientific merit. I'm glad the truth is finally coming out," Claire called Jarrett a week after the press conference with news. "I'm establishing a foundation in my grandmother's name. The Vance Foundation for Scientific Integrity. Its mission will be to support researchers whose work challenges established interests and to preserve evidence of innovation that's been suppressed. I want you to be the brute founding director." "I'm not qualified for that," Jarrett protested. "You're exactly qualified. You found evidence that others would have ignored or hidden, and you chose truth over personal gain. That's the entire mission. Plus, it comes with a salary, not huge, but enough to live on and support your daughter. The offer stunned him. A real job, meaningful work, financial stability, everything he'd lost years ago, returning in a form he could never have imagined. I don't know what to say. Say yes. We need people like you, Jarrett. People who understand that doing the right thing sometimes costs everything, and who do it anyway. That evening, Jarrett sat in his small apartment and thought about the journey from a tent in the woods to this moment. The path had been unexpected, frightening, and often felt impossible. But every step had led somewhere important. He pulled out Emma's drawing from his wallet, the crayon picture faded and soft from years of handling. Soon, he hoped, she'd be able to visit him here. See what he'd built from nothing but a $50 car and a determination to honor the truth. Tomorrow, he'd accept Claire's offer. He'd continue fighting the legal battles and testifying before Congress. He'd work to make sure Dr. Vance's legacy lived on and that her brother's sacrifice meant something. But tonight, he simply sat by the window and watched the rain fall on Timber Creek, grateful for every person who'd helped him along the way and every choice that had led him here. Sometimes rock bottom really was where your life was supposed to begin. He'd learned that truth, and now he was living it. The congressional hearings took place 6 weeks after the press conference. Jarrett rode the train to Washington with Claire and Ben, watching the country slide past the windows while rehearsing his testimony in his mind. Sarah Kim had prepared him extensively, but nothing quite matched the reality of sitting in front of television cameras and elected officials while the nation watched. The hearing room was packed. Jarrett sat at a long table facing the congressional panel, a microphone in front of him and water glass at his elbow. Senator Patricia Morrison from Oregon led the questioning. Mr. Albee, please tell us in your own words how you came to discover these materials. He told the story simply, without embellishment. The divorce, the job loss, the homelessness, the $50 car that represented shelter and ended up containing history, the choice to investigate rather than ignore what he'd found. At any point, Senator Morrison asked, were you offered compensation to keep this discovery quiet? Yes, multiple times. The final offer was $500,000. Murmurs rippled through the room. The senator leaned forward. That's a substantial sum, especially for someone in your circumstances. Why did you refuse? Jarrett thought about how to explain it. I have a 12-year-old daughter. I wanted to be someone she too could be proud of. Taking money to hide the truth that wouldn't have accomplished that. And Dr. Vance's work deserved better than to stay buried because it was inconvenient to wealthy interests. Dr. Cole testified next, presenting the technical analysis in clear terms that even non-scientists could understand. The prototype's efficiency ratings were genuine. The technology had been revolutionary. Its suppression had altered the trajectory of energy policy for decades. If this technology had been developed and deployed in the mid-70s, Dr. Cole concluded, we would likely be decades ahead of where we are now in renewable energy adoption. The climate crisis we're facing might look very different. We can't know for certain, but the potential impact was enormous. Claire spoke about her grandmother's life and work, about the family's decades of questions and grief. My grandmother died believing she'd failed. My uncle disappeared trying to preserve her legacy. Our family has lived with that loss for 50 years. But the real loss was to everyone who could have benefited from her innovations if they'd been allowed to develop. The most damaging testimony came from the former Department of Energy officials. They confirmed that Project Helios had been terminated not for scientific or budgetary reasons, but due to explicit pressure from energy industry representatives who viewed the technology as a threat to their market position. We were told that rapid deployment of highly efficient solar technology would destabilize the energy sector, one official testified. that it would cause unemployment in coal mining and oil extraction, that it would disrupt electrical grid infrastructure, that the economic consequences would be severe. In hindsight, I believe those concerns were exaggerated to protect specific financial interests rather than to serve the public good. Documents subpoenaed from corporate archives supported this account. Internal memos discussed strategies for neutralizing the Project Helios threat. Lobbying records showed payments to officials who'd voted to defund the program. The pattern was clear and damning. The hearings continued for 3 days, drawing testimony from energy experts, historians, environmental advocates, and industry representatives who tried to defend the decisions of 50 years ago. But the evidence was overwhelming, and public opinion had shifted decisively. Jarrett returned to Timber Creek, exhausted but satisfied. The truth was established now, documented in congressional record, impossible to suppress or deny. The legal cases began collapsing shortly after. The suit claiming the materials were improperly handled, government property was dismissed when the judge ruled that declassified documents found in abandoned private property belonged to the finder. The classified information lawsuit fell apart when prosecutors couldn't identify anything in the materials that remained legitimately classified. "They're withdrawing everything," Sarah Kim reported with barely contained glee. "They know they can't win, and continuing just generates more bad publicity." "You're clear, Jarrett. Legally, you're completely in the clear. But the real vindication came from the scientific community. The prototype was examined by laboratories across the country, all confirming Dr. Cole's analysis. Several researchers began working to replicate Dr. Vance's designs using modern materials and manufacturing techniques. Within months, 2 major solar companies announced they were incorporating principles from her work into next-generation panels. "Your grandmother's innovations are being revived," Jarrett told Claire during one of their regular calls. "Companies are licensing the designs, paying royalties to her estate. She's finally getting credit for what she created." "And Uncle Robert's sacrifice meant something," Claire replied. "He preserved this when everyone else wanted it forgotten. I wish he could know that it worked." Emma's first visit to the apartment came 3 months after the press conference. Angela had remained angry, but the court-appointed mediator had reviewed everything and concluded that Jarrett had demonstrated responsibility, integrity, and stable employment. Visitation was reinstated, starting with supervised day visits and progressing toward regular weekends. Emma climbed the stairs to the apartment above Donnelly Hardware with cautious curiosity. She examined the small space, the neat bed, the table with Jarrett's laptop and papers, the kitchenette where he'd learned to cook simple meals. "It's small," she said finally. "It is," Jarrett agreed, "but it's mine. Well, Frank lets me stay here, but it's home." She saw her crayon drawing, now framed and hanging on the wall above the table. "You kept that?" "I kept it through everything. It reminded me what I was working toward." They spent the afternoon walking around Timber Creek. Jarrett showed her the historical society where Ben worked, the library where Margaret had helped him research, the hardware store where Frank had given him employment and dignity when he'd had neither. "All these people helped you?" Emma asked. "They did, and they helped me because I was trying to do something that mattered. Sometimes good people appear exactly when you need them, but you have to be someone worth helping." At the end of the day, before Angela picked Emma up, his daughter hugged him tightly. "I am proud of you, Dad. I told my friends about what you did, about finding something important and making sure everyone knew about it, even though bad people didn't want you to." "What did your friends say?" "They said your dad is brave." And I said, "Yes, he is." Those words meant more than congressional testimony or legal victories or professional recognition. They meant he'd succeeded at the thing that mattered most, being someone his daughter could look up to. That evening, alone in the apartment, Jarrett thought about the improbable chain of events that had led here. A $50 car, a hidden lockbox, a scientist's lost innovations, a brother's desperate preservation, and finally, a homeless man who'd had nothing to lose and everything to prove. The story wasn't finished. The foundation work was just beginning, the legal victories needed defending, and his relationship with Emma needed continued rebuilding. But the essential thing was accomplished. The truth had come to light. Dr. Sarah Vance's legacy was restored, and Gerrit Albee had found his purpose. 6 months had passed since that rainy afternoon when Gerrit had stood before cameras and journalists, revealing what he'd found in a $50 car. Spring had come to Oregon, bringing green hills and clear skies, and with it came changes that felt like rebirth. The Vance Foundation for Scientific Integrity officially opened its offices in Portland, occupying a modest suite in a building near the university. Claire had assembled a small staff, a grant coordinator, a legal advisor, and Gerrit as founding director. His salary wasn't extravagant, but it was steady. More importantly, the work felt meaningful in a way nothing in his previous life ever had. The Foundation's mission was straightforward: support researchers whose work challenged established interests, preserve evidence of suppressed innovation, and advocate for transparency in scientific policy. They'd already funded 3 projects: a marine biologist studying ocean acidification, whose funding had been cut after publishing controversial findings, a material scientist working on battery technology that threatened patent holders, and a medical researcher investigating low-cost treatments that pharmaceutical companies had ignored. "We're doing what my grandmother couldn't do," Claire said at the Foundation's opening ceremony. "We're making sure that important work doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient to powerful people. And, quote, we're doing it because one man found something hidden and chose truth over comfort." Gerrit's personal life had stabilized in ways he'd hardly dared hope for. He'd moved from the apartment above the hardware store to a small house on the edge of Timber Creek, 2 bedrooms, a yard, a porch where he could sit in the evenings. Emma visited every other weekend now, sometimes staying for a week during school breaks. They'd rebuilt their relationship slowly, carefully, with honesty about the past and hope for the future. "She's proud of you," Angela had admitted during one pickup. "She tells everyone about what you did. It matters to her." The congressional hearings had led to genuine policy changes. A new law required government agencies to publicly disclose scientific research that had been previously suppressed for non-security reasons. The Department of Energy established an office dedicated to reviewing historical programs that had been terminated under questionable circumstances. 3 other suppressed energy innovations from the 70s and 80s had already been identified and were being re-examined. Dr. Cole had become something of a celebrity in scientific circles, giving lectures about Project Helios and the broader pattern of innovation suppression. "The story Gerrit uncovered isn't unique," he told audiences. "It's a pattern that repeats whenever breakthrough research threatens established economic interests. What makes this case special is that the evidence survived, and someone cared enough to bring it to light." Margaret had published her book, The Light That Was Hidden, Project Helios, and the Suppression of Solar Innovation. It became a surprise bestseller, teaching people about energy policy history through the lens of one scientist's lost work. She donated all the royalties to the Vance Foundation. Ben had received a grant to expand the Timber Creek Historical Society, which now housed a permanent exhibit about Project Helios. School groups visited regularly, learning about Dr. Sarah Vance and the importance of preserving scientific integrity. The prototype solar panel itself had been donated to the Smithsonian, where it occupied a place of honor in the Energy and Innovation exhibit. The placard read, "Dr. Sarah Vance's Revolutionary Solar Panel, 1972. Efficiency, 37%. Technology suppressed for economic reasons. Preserved by her brother Robert Vance. Rediscovered by Gerrit Albee in 2024. A reminder that progress requires both innovation and the courage to defend it." Frank Donnelly still ran his hardware store. though he'd hired additional help now that Jarrett worked at the foundation. They had lunch together every Tuesday, an informal tradition where they talked about everything and nothing, maintaining the friendship that had sustained Jarrett through his darkest time. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't bought that car?" Frank asked during one of these lunches. "All the time. The materials would have stayed hidden, maybe forever. Dr. Vance's work would have remained forgotten. Her family would never have known what happened to Robert. And you'd still be living in a tent, maybe, or maybe I'd have found some other path. But I wouldn't have found this purpose." On a warm Saturday afternoon in May, Jarrett stood at the podium in a university lecture hall, looking out at 200 students enrolled in a course called Science, Society, and Ethics. The professor had invited him to speak about his experience with Project Helios. "I'm not a scientist," he began, "and I'm not a historian. Until last year, I was a homeless man who'd lost everything: my marriage, my job, my home, my dignity. I bought a car for $50 because I needed shelter from the rain. What I found in that car changed my life, but more importantly, it changed how I understood what matters." He told them the story, watching young faces lean forward with interest. He talked about Dr. Vance's innovations, about Robert's sacrifice, about the choice between personal gain and public truth. "The lesson isn't that you'll find treasure in an old car," he said. "The lesson is that important truths are often hidden by people who benefit from keeping them buried. And sometimes, ordinary people, people with nothing, people nobody expects anything from, those are the people who end up defending those truths. Not because they're heroes, but because they recognize that some things matter more than personal comfort." After the lecture, students approached with questions. One young woman asked what advice he'd give to people facing difficult ethical choices. Jarrett thought about the moment he'd refused $500,000, about the fear and uncertainty that had followed, about everything that had happened since. "Ask yourself what you want the people you love to know about you," he said. "Not what's easiest or most profitable, but what you'd be proud to tell them you did. Then do that, even if it's hard." That evening, Emma came for the weekend. They made dinner together in Jarrett's small kitchen spaghetti, her favorite, and ate on the porch while the sun set over Timber Creek. She talked about school, about her friends, about a science project she was working on, about renewable energy. "I told my teacher about Grandma Vance," she said. "Not my real grandma, but the scientist whose work you found. My teacher said she was a pioneer. She was, and she deserved better than what happened to her. But you fixed it. You made sure people knew what she did. I helped bring the truth to light. A lot of people helped: Margaret, Ben, Dr. Cole, Claire, Frank. And your support meant everything to me. Knowing you were proud of me, that gave me courage when I was afraid." Emma leaned against his shoulder. "I'm still proud of you, Dad." They sat together as darkness fell and lights began appearing in windows across the small town. Jarrett thought about the journey that had brought him here, the losses and struggles, the unexpected discovery, the choice to honor truth over comfort, and the community that had formed around that choice. He still drove the Mercury sometimes, though it was restored now, its rust repaired and its engine running. He'd been offered significant money for it by collectors, but he'd refused. The car was part of the story, a reminder that value could hide in unexpected places and that purpose could emerge from desperation. Sometimes rock bottom really was where your life was supposed to begin. Jarrett had learned that truth in a tent in the woods, proven it in a salvage yard, and lived it through months of uncertainty and fear. Now he had work that mattered, a daughter who was proud of him, and the knowledge that he'd helped restore justice to people who'd been wronged by history. Dr. Sarah Vance's innovations were being revived, her name was being honored, and her belief that science should serve humanity was being defended by a foundation that would continue long after everyone involved in this story was gone. Robert Vance's sacrifice had not been in vain. The evidence he'd preserved had reached the light. And Gerrit Albi, who'd once had nothing but $50 and desperation, had found something worth passing on, not just the story of suppressed innovation, but the lesson that ordinary people could defend truth against power, that purpose could emerge from loss, and that doing what was right mattered more than anything wealth could buy. As Emma fell asleep in the guest room that night, Gerrit stood by her doorway, watching her breathe softly, peacefully. Tomorrow they'd go hiking, maybe visit the Historical Society, definitely stop by Frank's store for ice cream. Simple pleasures, but profound in their ordinariness. He'd lost everything once and rebuilt from nothing. He'd found hidden truth and chosen to defend it. He'd faced threats and pressure and the temptation of easy money, and he'd stayed true to what mattered. Now, he had a life worth living, work worth doing, and a daughter who knew her father was someone who stood up for what was right, even when it cost everything. That was legacy enough for any man. The light that had been hidden was shining again, and Gerrit Albi had helped bring it forth. That truth, simple and profound, would last long after the rust had consumed the old mercury, and the years had carried everyone in this story beyond memory. Some lights once revealed could never be extinguished again.